This short online lecture is a tutorial on the style of Mannerism, which hopefully will be a helpful complement to your Chapter 15 reading. Mannerism is the first style that is covered in this chapter. I've put up here on the screen a visual that I put together that is intended to give you a sense of chronology, where styles fall during certain periods of time. And you can see here with some of the dates, we have 1495 is an important date, marking the end of the early Renaissance and the beginning of the High Renaissance. And 1495, as you may recall, is the year that Leonardo da Vinci produced his iconic painting, The Last Supper, which many scholars see as significant enough in differences from the early Renaissance to indicate a stylistic change. The High Renaissance more or less ends around 1600. This is a little bit of a debate among art historians. Some people argue that perhaps the High Renaissance ended in 1517, which you can see at the bottom of your screen is when the Reformation begins. So perhaps Mannerism and High Renaissance coexist, depending on the art historian you talk to and their preferences for dates. That maybe this may not be the case. It just depends. The point is the dating is sketchy, and that Mannerism and the High Renaissance may or may not have coexisted, but they certainly existed in Italy around the same time period, or well within range of one another. Here's an example of a Mannerist painting, and I have a list here of common characteristics of Mannerist paintings, some of the style features. And you can feel free to pause this video, take a moment, and note these stylistic features within your notes. It's kind of interesting that Mannerism and the High Renaissance coexisted, maybe, because they almost are like polar opposites of one another. And you can kind of see that when you think back to what you saw with the High Renaissance and what we're seeing here with Mannerist painting. There is a lot of differences. So if you look at this painting, let's see if we can point out some of these Mannerist features. First of all, we do have proportional inconsistencies. And you can see that primarily when you're looking at the treatment of form that you see here when you are looking at this figure right here. And you have this kind of elongated torsos that aren't exactly true to life with proportional treatment. You also can see some of it not quite as obvious in this torso right in here. So inaccurate proportion. And this is kind of interesting because we know that in the High Renaissance that artists are very careful to create the human form as realistically as possible. And even someone like Leonardo went as far as to pretty much illegally study corpses as a way to truly understand the mechanical workings of the body. Here, really that accuracy is not a concern. Another thing that's kind of related to proportion inconsistencies that is not listed on this list, but you can certainly add to your notes, is you have like the really weird treatment of position. Like here, this guy is kind of like leaning on his toes, looking like he's about to fall over. He's on this cloth, which maybe is balancing him, but it's not something that's very clear. He's leaning forward, but Jesus is leaning backwards. It's just very weird and very awkward. Another feature that we see, not exactly in this painting, but you certainly will see it in the next example I will show you, is that there is a level of elegance and sophistication. As I said, we'll talk more about this in the next slide. We also see with Mannerist work that there's a level of ambiguity. It's kind of hard to tell what's going on. You can see the ambiguity, like for example, in these facial expressions. It's really hard to clearly read what these people are feeling. Is this sadness? Is it grief? Is it confusion? Is it illness? That's kind of a weird head right there. What's this lady feeling? Is this surprise? It's kind of hard to tell. And maybe prior knowledge that this is a scene of the crucifixion. Jesus has been crucified. They're getting ready to lay him to rest in his tomb. If you know that, maybe you can interpret these facial expressions, but even still, very ambiguous. Maybe she's pointing at Jesus, but she's kind of like high up in the pointing. It doesn't look like she's gesturing towards him. Not really sure. This lady may be gesturing towards Mary. Hard to say. Very ambiguous. And then finally we have artifice. And what that means is that the artists are very clear to let the viewer know that the art is not real. In the Renaissance, artists are so concerned with naturalism. They're trying to depict nature as accurately and as realistically as possible. Maybe even perhaps to try to fool the viewer into thinking that what they're looking at is real. There is no attempt on the part of the artist. There's no way that we could look at this and think mistakenly that we were looking at a real image. Now you might be wondering why. Why is it that we see this style that's so different from the High Renaissance style? You know, what's leading to such a kind of weird, and really that's the only description you can give, this weird style of painting. And it seems that a lot of it is in response to the Reformation. The Reformation essentially splits Christendom, and this is something that is really almost spiritually and psychologically traumatic for a lot of people. For so long, the church was the guiding principle of people's lives in all respects, not just religious. And to have the church split, and to have the church being called into question, and to have people leaving the church left people really confused. You know, what church should I belong to? Or what school of thought? What does this mean for my spiritual salvation? People were really confused, they were really scared, and I think that a lot of these anxieties are coming out in this really strange form of painting. Here's another example. This is another really famous Mannerist work of art, Madonna with the long neck. This is an example of the elegant aspect of Mannerism. You see it in the beautiful clothing that Mary is wearing. Very nice in fabric. You see the beautiful hairstyle, very elegant, this nice little headpiece that she's wearing, everything very elegant, very sophisticated. Otherwise, though, the painting's super weird. You have these really weird long fingers, elongated torso, proportional inconsistency, and creepy, weird, long baby. You have elongation here in the leg. So proportional inconsistencies, it's just weird. And that's not meant to be negative, it's just kind of what it is. It's just these are very strange images. Ambiguity. Who are these girls? Are they even girls? Are they angels? Are they attendants? What's exactly happening? Who's this weird little man? He's reading this sort of biblical narrative that compares Madonna's neck with a pillar. Here's your pillar, here's your long neck. And then finally, Mannerism, portraiture. Mannerist portraiture is a very important part of the style, very common type of artwork that we see being produced during this time. Your book does a beautiful job of talking about Mannerist portraiture. The author offers a variety of subjects painted in different ways, different kinds of people, and then I've included an image not in your textbook to give you yet another view. Mannerist portraiture features a lot of the similar stylistic features that were listed and observed in the previous two works. One additional feature, though, with Mannerist portraiture is that the portraits are very formal. And if you look at this portrait, you can see a lot of the formality. You see it in what looks like more formal clothing, very nice, dark in color. The figure stands in a formal, erect pose, not at all casual. And even the composition itself lends a sense of formality. The artist uses a limited color palette, primarily neutral, so no really fun, interesting colors, and then very, very severe, with all of these sharp analytical lines that make up the majority of the compositional space. Now, we are looking at a portrait of a young man. if we want to be a little bit more specific than that, we clearly see that we're looking at a young man of privilege. And just the fact that there's a portrait of him indicates privilege in and of itself. Because as we know, during this time period, portraiture was something that was reserved primarily for, not primarily, but only for the upper class. We don't see representations of the everyman in portraiture until the emergence of photography in the 1820s. Now, what also is indicative of a higher status with this man is that this portrait was painted by a Bronzino, who was like the portrait superstar of the Mannerist period. Only the best of the best get a portrait painted by Bronzino. See if you can take a moment, pause the video, look at this painting, and try to identify other features of wealth and status in this artwork. You can see the fine clothing, beautifully tailored, lots of these really nice details. We have some jewelry, some fancy woodwork that is typical Mannerist in that it's creepy and weird. He's holding a book. The book alone is indicative of status because at this time, learning and literacy was something that was primarily reserved for the upper class. And it's kind of interesting because education now is so accessible, and when you're younger it's required. And so it's very hard sometimes for people to see what a privilege education is. And when you look at these paintings, you're reminded that it is indeed a privilege that not everyone was able to access earlier on in history. Now, some other Mannerist features, weird hand in an unnatural position. Okay, this does not be a casual way that someone would position a hand. And then also it seems sort of interesting to me, and perhaps a Mannerist feature, is the weird eye. It seems as though Bronzino may have wanted to, or perhaps the patron would have wanted him to, take some liberties in the depiction of the eye and not make it look off into the distance in that way. It's kind of this idea that you want to, when you have a picture of yourself, present yourself in the best light. And think of the contemporary selfie. That when you see selfies posted on social media, you're probably actually looking at one of like 30 pictures that person took to try to get the picture that looks the best. And the result is a highly, highly artificial image of what somebody actually looks like. And you would think that that kind of idealization would be the same as the idealization would be the same in this image, but it seems not to be. Now you could argue that, well, perhaps Bronzino, or maybe the patron himself, asked to be depicted true to life. But we know that that's not really a stylistic feature of the Mannerist style. That we're having, artifice and things being fake, that they're not really trying to see a sense of accuracy. Although maybe because this is a portrait, that feature of the style may not apply. So it could be just Bronzino's faith to reality, or it could just be Mannerist portraiture trying to be weird.